Okay, welcome back, everyone, from lunch to this after luncheon session of the Caribbean Conference on Corruption, Compliance, and Cybercrime 2021, organized by the Caribbean Development Bank. We have a special topic, and I know it's very difficult at times to engage the audience after lunch, but I think our panel will keep you awake. So the topic is Rethinking AML CFT Compliance Lessons for the Caribbean. Why this topic and why this juncture? It would appear that there's a bit of synergy between the climate debate that happened a few weeks ago in Scotland and this conference and this topic, Rethinking AML CFT Compliance. Because I think the AML CFT world, some may disagree, is in a bit of a crisis. After 3 decades, money laundering continues to pose a significant threat to the global financial system, with some $2 trillion being laundered globally annually. The revelation of the Panama, Pandora, and Paradise Papers indicate that the money laundering risks, and the serious money laundering cases are not as expected in the developing world, but more so in the developed world. And after approximately 31 years, it appears that the FATF-led compliance, AML CFT compliance system is not working in terms of success with the desired results. Recently, a very high-level executive in the FATF said there is a chasm between what the FATF recommends, what governments do, what the police are able to do, what regulators do, and real-world implementation by firms. And thus far, approximately 100 countries, I may be wrong, Dawne, I stand to be corrected by Dawne, about 100 countries have been evaluated by both the FATF and the FSRBs. And all the reports are on the FATF website. But based on the information, it would appear from comments from the official in the FATF, he says no one is doing well and no one is doing enough. For the Caribbean, we've had maybe 10 mutual evaluation reports that have been published thus far. Again, I stand to be corrected by Dawne. But so far, 6 of the countries are or were in the FATF grey list. 2 of them are off the list, and 4 of them are now in the ICRG process. 3 of them are in the pool, and again, I stand to be corrected by Dawne, and may go into ICRG at any time. And 1 country didn't meet the criteria for the FATF ICRG. Importantly, what the official from the FATF says is that leaders in most countries still don't properly understand or are not genuinely motivated to act upon MLTF risks. And after 3 decades, the FATF, based upon information that is on the FATF website, is undertaking a strategic review with 2 prongs. 1 prong is strengthening the efficiency and the effectiveness of the FATF itself, and making the FATF country assessments and monitoring processes more timely, effective, and risk-based. The other prong is identifying drivers of positive change and exploring the positive impact that innovative technologies such as data mining, data analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence can make on AML CFT efforts worldwide. So based upon this system, there appears to be a need for and a time for fundamental change. And the FATF, as standard setter, based upon its the prongs of its strategic review, and its frank and open introspection process, has laid the door completely open for innovative, creative thinking. So that's what our panel is going to do today. Share with you their thoughts on this topic, and provide leadership in terms of projecting us into the future, what the new system can or may look like. So we have a very esteemed panel, people who I know extremely well. They're my friends. First, we have Dawne Spicer, the Executive Director of the CFATF. We have Shelley Nichols-Hunte, Compliance Manager, Barbados Workers Union Cooperative Credit Union. And we have Dr. Rohan Clarke from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jamaica. In terms of organizing ourselves, we'll have each panelist will have 5 minutes. Then we'll have 10 minutes of questions between myself and the panelists. And then we'll have about 20 or 25 minutes with the audience. And then after, we'll have 5 minutes or 10 minutes of takeaways. So Dawne, I pass the floor over to you for your 5 minutes presentation. And I'm going to be very strict with the timekeeping.
So a very good afternoon, or well, a very good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone. Thank you, Calvin. It must be really an earth-shattering topic. I don't know if it showed on my face. I definitely felt it in my heart. But at the start of Calvin's discussion, we had an earthquake here, and I'm on the 20th floor of a building that sways when we have an earthquake. So if you saw fear, it was legitimate. So we would hope that we would not have to leave the building during the presentation, and that it ended with that mild reminder that we live in an earthquake zone. So regarding the topic, I'd like to start by saying focusing on the region. A regional landscape for AML CFT compliance is guided by, our regional landscape, I should say, is guided by the FATF standards. This means that countries' legislative and administrative frameworks, along with any processes, are informed by the requirements of the FATF standards as it pertains to money laundering and terrorist financing. It should be noted that the standards are minimal standards, which means countries are free to have more stringent measures as they deem necessary. The implementation of the standards also involves the use of a risk-based approach geared at ensuring that the limited resources available are used to address the highest money laundering, terrorist financing risk that countries face. Determining money laundering, terrorist financing risk levels is essential and not a static process. And national, sectoral, and other risk assessments have to be done periodically to accommodate factors that impact a country's risk profile. AML CFT compliance is an area where changes will be required based on new or increased risk as a result of new products, clients, or methodologies for doing business. The COVID-19 pandemic has also caused a rethink of AML CFT compliance, with fundamental institutions and others engaged in digital transformation regarding the onboarding of customers for customer due diligence, etc. Some larger entities have used regulatory sandboxes to assist them with this transformation. As legitimate businesses have changed the way business has to be done, so have criminals, with a noted increase during the pandemic in fraud and the use of struggling businesses to infiltrate their illicit funds. So they're taking advantage of the fact that there is an economic downturn. They're taking advantage of the fact that people now have to work remotely and do business remotely. As small states with limited resources and ever-changing risk and risk mitigation requirements, countries can feel as though they're in a constant state of flux. It never stops. They're always having to do something, meet some requirement, get on a list, get off a list, etc. We have found that there's generally a good understanding of technical compliance and a strong legal frameworks, but the ability to demonstrate effective implementation of the system is challenging. So, for example, the levels of investigations, prosecutions, and convictions for money laundering and in rare cases for terrorist financing is low. Overall, there are also limited returns regarding the confiscation of illicit property. It therefore raises questions as to what can be done to make improvements and avoid a concept of a system that seems to foster a one-size-fits-all or a tick box approach. Accordingly, There needs to be a greater level of understanding of the international AML CFT standards and how a true risk-based approach should be implemented. Elements of context, such as political stability, levels of corruption, the level of financial inclusion, and transparency, are often used, but there seems to be less emphasis on the important contextual factor of materiality, which may include the size of the financial sector, the country's level of development, geographical factors, and population size. This in itself is a work in progress that needs to occur at all levels of the process of assessment and with the competent authorities such as regulators and law enforcement and the private sector stakeholders, such as financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions.
Dawne, I'm gonna have to interrupt you. It's now 5 minutes have gone.
Okay.
And so we are going to regiment the timekeeping. And so,
no problem.
So thank you very much, Dawne, for that informative introduction. And so I'll pass the floor over now to Shelley for her 5 minutes of observations.
Hi, good day, Calvin. Good day, other colleagues. Good day, audience. There's nothing quite like a natural disaster to bring a country to its knees, whether earthquakes, volcano, pandemics. We have seen quite a bit in our lifetime over the last 18 months, right in the Caribbean region alone. But then apart from that, there's one other thing that I often say will always also bring a country to its knees, and that's compliance with the FATF standards. And while it may not be, some person may not agree with the way that's been put over, we've seen not only in Caribbean, but also around the globe, especially small island developing states have to pull up their bootstraps, as it were, as far as it relates to AML compliance. Now, there has been what I call a double-edged sword as far as it relates to AML compliance. There's been the positive and perhaps the challenges. With the positives of AML compliance, even in terms of being on gray lists and so on, we have heard even some of my colleagues, the technocrats, speak about the positives of the AML compliance when it comes to DNFBPs that were previously, they found it very challenging to come into the AML CFT framework willingly. That has changed with some gray listing. We've had, while we still have a way to go as far as it relates to ML confiscations and investigations and so on, there's been that increase across the Caribbean, across the globe. And even as far as it relates to, now we're talking about proliferation financing, risk assessments, and enhanced ways in terms of maintenance of statistics and knowing what is required by each jurisdiction, each entity within its jurisdiction. So there have been those types of improvements. And even from a resource point of view, units now have been resourced handsomely, where before there have been challenges in doing so. So that's the positives. But then on the other end, as has been so rightly and appropriately described by the FATF, in their paper on the unintended consequences of the compliance with AML standards, we have the challenges where the same very thing that we want to avoid can end up happening. And I mean things such as financial exclusion. No country wants an underground economy, but because of either the incorrect application of the AML standards, or some would say not a fair application across the board by various countries of the AML standards, these are typical issues that may arise. And so whether it's a financial exclusion or whether there's that great emphasis, for example, on certain areas such as on nonprofit organizations and so on, obviously to ensure that they're not abused for terrorist financing. Here it is that COVID came and as we say in the Caribbean, upset our apple cart, and ushered in a great level of digitization and realization that we do need NPOs, need to see NPOs in a certain way to ensure we have a fair and accurate balance on how we deal with NPOs for terrorist financing, and so that we don't end up pushing them out of the financial system. And so these are just some of the things that I guess we will discuss as time goes on, as far as it relates to whether or not things have been quite evenly. I certainly have realized, when I was in government, I realized it, and it's more so now that there are great challenges of implementation. And I really think there needs to be more of a marriage between public and private to be able to ensure that we can get these things done. So I'll just give the appetizer for now,
Yeah.
Calvin, and I will move on. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Shelley. Thank you, Shelley. You ended right and bang on 5 minutes. And now, Rohan, please.
Hi, good day, everyone, and viewers around the world. Welcome. This is going to be a quite provocative session, so welcome. Just to preface my presentation by saying that the views expressed are my own and not necessarily the views of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Jamaica. That said, though, I think my primary contention is that the international AML CFT regime, as we know it, is inherently anti-development. And this needs fundamental rethinking. What do I mean by this? I think if we look at most other areas of global regulatory governance, there are some core development sensitive principles that are missing from AML CFT regulatory governance. I speak specifically of democratic accountability and legitimacy, full and effective participation, and genuine policy ownership. And against this background, I want to suggest that there are three systemic issues that need careful rethinking. One is the overarching institutional architecture of AML CFT governance. The second one is the coercive enforcement practices that have been normalized to ensure compliance. And the third is the question of supporting developing countries' capacity to comply with AML CFT standards. With respect to the institutional architecture, I think there's need for frank exchanges about whether the current institutional framework is fit for purpose. I think it's now broadly accepted that there wasn't any, the Fatf itself wasn't the product of any deliberate institutional design. It wasn't an intellectual process that was meant to take account of the needs of developing countries. It was a temporary body with a very restricted geographic scope. So it wasn't a development enterprise. A decade after the FATF was established, then Executive Secretary Dylan Griffith said that the Financial Action Task Force is not and has no pretensions to become the United Nations of the anti-money laundering world. To remain a cohesive body would be threatened if our membership were to become significantly larger. Where are we now, 3 decades later? Disproportionate power is still wielded by the G7, the OECD, and FATF ministers in terms of agenda setting for anti-money laundering. We've seen the slow pace at which development issues such as financial inclusion and de-risking came to the fore in terms of the anti-money laundering agenda. And this was driven largely by developing countries, NGOs, and interest groups from the global south. And this is reflected in the political rhetoric coming out of the region about this fundamental unfairness within the existing architecture. The second point is that of enforcement compliance. I think the Financial Action Task Force and the FATF regional style bodies have come a long way, but the Financial Action Task Force still needs to repair its legitimacy. I think from the very outset of the regime, Caribbean offshore financial centers were unfairly targeted by naming and shaming under the non-cooperative countries and territories blacklist, and then the OECD Harmful Tax Practices Initiative. So these standards were diffused coercively, and rather than as a development enterprise which sought to encourage genuine policy ownership. Caribbean countries still continue to render account to multiple sources of authority. There is Fatf, there is the EU, there is the US, whose regulatory expectations don't always align, and this leads to a bottomless barrel of regulatory demands. The Pandora's Papers most recently have demonstrated that as financial integrity standards increase in the Caribbean, what we're finding is that international mobile capital is being repatriated to opaque onshore financial centers. And I speak specifically of centers such as Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada, which, because of the US constitutional arrangements, are sometimes outside the reach of the federal government. And lastly, just to close, is the question of compliance capacity and supporting the compliance capacity of developing countries. The Fatf standards are dynamic, and there's a presumption that the risk-based approach has attenuated the compliance obligations of developing countries. But as the standards change, there is an equivalent expansion in the responsibilities of regulators, supervisors, and financial institutions. And I think those compliance obligations need to be given careful thought.
Okay, thank you very much, Rohan. You made several points of critique of the current FATF system. Dawne, you would have heard, what Rohan has said, and you are, you can say, an insider at the FATF. You are co-chair of the GUNC, the Global Network Coordinating Group, and you've been attending FATF meetings for quite a while. You know that the developing countries of the 9 FATF-style regional bodies, who make up 180 approximately of the 209 countries that make up the AML CFT Global Network, they do not have a vote at the FATF in terms of formulating, crafting the standards and enforcing the standards. So, Dawne, what would you say to Rohan in terms of his observation, critiquing the current system, and in terms of unfairness and coercive enforcement?
Just to start off with a correction, I am no longer the co-chair of the GNCG group. So just that correction, please. With regard to it and inside of the FATF, well, like many other delegations of the 209 members of the global network, yes, I attend meetings, participate at the FATF level. What can I say? The only thing constant is change. And in my introduction, this is what I tried to put across, that it is not a static process. Crime is not static. The risk-based approach is not a static process. So there has to be ongoing and consistent change. Do the FATF members maybe have greater leverage in their own organization? The answer is yes. And that would probably obtain if you visit any FSRB. Each of its members would have more leverage at its own meetings. Each of its members would have voting powers at their own particular meetings. What I can say is there's a high level of inclusivity in terms of the ability of members to participate, all members in the global network to participate in the discussions, to respond to papers, not only those attending, but in terms of delegations, responding to all the papers and to keep in abreast. And that's how you get your word in. So the CFATF members have been participating in discussions, and they have been able to, again, it's a, what shall I say, the majority, but have been able to get their ideas across. CFATF as an FSRB along with other FSRBs. So yes, the system will always need tweaking and it will always need work, but it's a balance between what the system is, understanding the system, and implementing the system properly. And I think the issue is in terms of understanding the system properly, understanding a risk-based approach and using it properly. And that is a big challenge for most countries in the region. And That's my take on it. So that's all I wish to say at this point in time in response. But it's not, I don't want to put it in terms of black and white, fair or not fair. I want to put it that everyone is allowed a voice. What's the impact of that voice? Yes, there are differences in the impact of those voices, but everyone is allowed a voice at the table.
Okay, and how would you respond to the notion that, as you know, the facts, I should say, that predominantly developing countries, for the 20-year period that the NCCT process and the ICRG processes have been in place, it's mostly developing countries who are being blacklisted or graylisted, and in over a 20-year period, despite the fact that there are significant shortcomings in the assessment process within the global network. Only one FATF member has been graylisted, and only graylisted for a very short period of time, as compared to the other countries that were graylisted. So, how do you respond to that?
Me also?
Yes, Dawne. Yes, Dawne.
No, I thought other members of the panel would be
yes, I know,
involved.
but
I'm sorry.
I'd like to hear your views. For the benefit of the audience, some 1,400 people in 45 countries. I'm sure they're very interested in this area as well.
Small developing countries, limited resources. It's a difficult process. We have mainly strong AML CFT legal frameworks, levels of technical compliance. As a matter of fact, it's public knowledge. Cayman Islands recently, based on our last plenary and their re-rating follow-up report, are one of 2 countries in the world right now that has all 40 recommendations rated compliant or largely compliant. So there is a lot of work being done. There is a lot of progress, but these are small developing countries. Resources is an issue. Resources has become even more of an issue because of the pandemic. Diversion of resources is an issue. So the implementation, as I said, of the effectiveness part of the FATF standards is where there is a challenge. And once there's a challenge there, that is that road leads to being listed in terms of what getting onto the FATF gray list. What it has done, however, is cause these countries where, and of course that is based on terms of looking at the financial impact of those jurisdictions globally. What it has done by having those countries in the process, as difficult as it has been, as long as the road has been, the negative impacts of being gray listed, etc. What it has done, it has given those countries a course of action, an action plan to achieve their goals, decrease their deficiencies, and reach a higher level of compliance on a set time frame. So there have been positives for all the countries that have been there. And yes, it's again, it's a long road, but it's a balance.
Okay. Shelley, you've been on both sides of the divide. You've been a public servant in Barbados, as well as now you're in the private sector. And how do you, based upon that breadth of experience, how do you react to, the fact that, the standards were promulgated first in 2012, the revised FATF 40, and then the methodology, the system by which the assessment process is undertaken in 2013. Do you think that the countries should have been better prepared, for the process, given that sort of timeline between the promulgation of the standards and the start of the 4th round? What would you say in terms of the experience of Barbados?
Okay. I would say that there's the preparation and the support of the RFSRB, CFATF, as far as it relates to ensuring that the technocrats are trained and understand what the standards are and understand not only the effectiveness, not only technical compliance, but also the effectiveness arm. I would say, though, that having compared the 3rd round and the 4th round, and this was a comment I would have made back in 2014 when I was trained as an assessor as well, was that I saw that although it was the same week, the breadth of preparation, I thought, for the fourth round needed to be deeper, perhaps because of having the effectiveness now added to it. It may have required perhaps a 2-week preparation for the technocrats to be able to understand. So yes, you had your certificate and what have you, but then at the end of the week, but from the point of view of cutting your teeth, of course, whether it's an evaluation or getting your experience, as they say, on the ground, that's when it came. But it was still, in many cases, a lot of unanswered questions that were occurring as far as it relates to the various jurisdictions. But then, apart from that, while it is the technocrats, we have had very intense and very high caliber of training and sensitization, whether by the Secretariat or whether by the different international organizations, giving the technical support. I really believe, and I'm seeing that even across the mutual evaluations and just speaking to colleagues in the private sector as well, and even colleagues in the public sector from the other Caribbean jurisdictions, that more of a marriage with the private sector is required. So yes, the public sector entities understand the IOs and the RECs, very, very well, and some more than others according to your year's experience. But then in terms of the private sector, then there's that void in a sense as to the understanding. So maybe not to the extent of training of a technocrat in terms of the public sector, but more of an understanding as why it matters. Because it's very easy for the private sector, you're thinking about bottom line, you're thinking about your liquidity, you're thinking about paying your staff and compliance costs and all these sorts of things. But fully understanding the large picture, we've learned that, yes, by having the stick of the gray listing and what was it like to be on the list and enhanced monitoring of a country right down to the individual FI. But then apart from that, being also able to more understand what is being required, having more of those working groups and so on. So there's less of I would say, a distrust or less of a them and us scenario. But at the end of the day, each jurisdiction wants to be able to perform well. And both, as you call it, sides of divide are necessary to go for, because when there's a gray listing or a black listing, it's the whole country that's affected. So having more of that sensitization and that dialogue on a consistent basis. And while there's that improvement over the years, I think we still have a long way to go to have a good marriage that works.
Right. Thank you, Shelley. Rohan, your country, fortunately, is on the grey list. What they've said as part of the critique of the current system is that leaders in most countries still don't properly understand or are not genuinely motivated to act upon money laundering, terrorist financing risks. And so in terms of as an academic and now, as a civil servant, what would you say would your advice be in terms of the leadership of each country or countries around the Caribbean being front and center in terms of the entire AML CFT process?
Well, I think first and foremost, I just want to disabuse people of the perception that there is somehow a strong inertia within the Caribbean, among Caribbean governments, to comply with AML CFT standards. Last year, the Fatf president openly admitted that despite some successes, the vast amount of countries are failing to implement the necessary measures. Overall, compliance costs are high, but confiscation of dirty money are low. And I think that's the essence of the problem in the Caribbean. It comes back to resources. Resources. We're speaking about increasing digitization, increased use of big data, data mining, artificial intelligence in AML CFT compliance. But if you look at the pace of technology transfer and technology transfer from the global north to the global south, and diffusion within global south, and particularly within the Caribbean, this is extraordinarily slow. So then how do we expect Caribbean countries to comply at the expected level as their counterparts from advanced financial centers that are also struggling? And I think ultimately for the Caribbean, it's a question of resources.
Okay. So the political will is there, and you're saying advocating that there's need for more resources, as I think Shelley and Dawne also added. Can I now go to the questions from the audience? And Dawne, someone said you made a vital comment around change. They said most audits are retroactive. What are the tools and technologies used to be proactive and agile? You may be seeing the questions as well in your on the right hand side of your screen.
Yes, my interpretation of the question, yes, change is ongoing. Again, it's a marrying. So like what Rohan just said with regard to resources, with regard to a move to digital transformation, it's the larger financial institutions that are going to be able to do that. The smaller financial institutions are not going to be able to take part in that digital transformation. That brings with it, of course, other issues of financial inclusion or exclusion in terms of where people now cannot access this whole digitalized world. In terms of audits, yes, are retroactive, and similarly, a mutual evaluation gives a snapshot of where a country is at a particular point in time, looking 4 to 5 years retroactively. However, in looking at that 5-year retroactive period, you have to see where the country has built from where it started, how it has improved, how it has increased its what shall I say, its AML, CFT systems, etc. Going forward as part of the process, and I don't want to go into what the whole mutual evaluation process is, but it continues following the on-site with a follow-up process. And there you continue to monitor what improvements the country is making towards meeting the deficiencies that were met in the report. A few countries, I should say, in terms of FIUs, have gone in terms of a digital way with electronic STRs, but it is still very slow. What is important and what I like to throw in here, and was at the end of what I was stating at the beginning, is the need for more public-private partnerships. And that is very in its embryonic stage in the region, but it's something that we need to develop more. Going on to the point that Shelley made, there is training in terms of preparation before and on-site for the private sector. But again, the country and the private sector, the competent authorities in the country with the private sector, they need to have more cooperation and collaboration, not just a year before an on-site and the CFATF arrives, and not just, it ends when the CFATF leaves. It needs to be an ongoing process. And I think that would help. I'm not sure that I answered the question, because I could say I'm not aware of what tools and technologies are available with regard to the audit.
I was going to come back to you about that, but
yes,
perhaps we can just move on. I think there are lots of questions here, lots of issues to be covered on this topic. But maybe, as Toussaint said, maybe in the near future we'd have a dedicated conference on AML CFT issues. But let's continue with the questions. One question says, how are global geopolitical risk environment issues and the trends being incorporated in the corruption and compliance risk mitigation practices? Who would like to take that? Shelley, you were at the FIU. You would have seen, I think you participated in typologies exercises when you were at the CFATF as a member of Barbados's delegation. So what would you say to this question? Shall I repeat it again?
Sure, thank you.
All right. How are global geopolitical risk environment issues and the trends being incorporated in the corruption and compliance risk mitigation practices?
Well, It goes back, first of all, in terms of understanding compliance and understanding, well, I should say compliance and generally anti-corruption efforts that we have in a region. And in terms of what's happening now and what is going on and how far we are reaching as a region, we still have quite a way to go, even in terms of anti-corruption efforts. I think in terms of the AML CFT compliance side of things, because we have other types of compliance as well, but in terms of AML CFT compliance, because of the pressure of the mutual evaluation process and so on, we've found we're trying our best. I think very, very much the region is working very diligently. There's been that political will, generally speaking, from the region in terms of improving our situation. In terms of anti-corruption efforts, while there is, yes, the process, and we have the convention in place, and anti-corruption convention in place, and so on, there's still quite a bit that has to be done in terms of globally, I would say specifically in terms of the Caribbean, in terms of anti-corruption efforts. Yes, we have anti-corruption commissions in several of the Caribbean jurisdictions, but not many of the Caribbean jurisdictions have actually come under evaluation of sorts by the international organization as far as it relates to that. Is it to say that we only can be seen to be compliant in the face of that additional external pressure? In some respects, yes. In other respects, I would say no, from the point of view that because we are seeing more of a symbiosis between the international organization dealing with AML, CFT compliance and other types of compliance in relation to corruption and other areas and so on, cybercrime and so on, and that marriage going on there from the international organization point of view, there are these other issues that come up. And as you know, corruption is a predicate offense for money laundering. And so with efforts still happening, there is that integration that has started, not only from a country level, but whittled down to a jurisdictional level, where in some entities, some financial entities, you will have anti-corruption officers, and that whole concept of convergence, where it's just not AML compliance, not just money laundering reporting officer, but other areas as well. But I think really and truly, if I'm being very honest, regarding anti-corruption efforts, we still do have a long way to go as a region as that. So yes, we have our specific cases that will pop up that will force us to have attention, Transparency International and so on, that would give their index and so on, but we still have quite a way to go as far as that's concerned.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. Next question is with regards to unfairness, what relaxation of standards or special assistance is available to, example, a nation like Haiti, who is currently on the FATF ICRG list, compared to any of the more developed Caribbean countries? Shall I repeat it again? With regards to unfairness, what relaxation of standards or special assistance is available to a country like Haiti compared to any of the more developed countries in the Caribbean? Dawne, you want to have a go?
Yes, very briefly. I'd like to start by saying, again, I'm going to probably beat this like a dead horse in this panel, but it's the proper implementation of the risk-based approach and of the standards. So the standards do allow for simplified measures where the risks are low. So again, in terms of simplified measures, that can happen where your risks are low. The FATF standards are not asking you to do things as if your risks are high and you have enhanced due diligence and you have a whole ramped up system. That being said, Haiti is, one of our members and very near and dear to us. They're going through a very difficult time, and I think globally everyone is aware of that. And all efforts are being made by the CFATF members, international financial institutions, etc., to provide technical assistance and training to Haiti. One of the issues, however, is the instability within the country itself, and the fact that some of the things that need to be done will require a hands-on participation or will require people meeting virtually in groups. And at present, to my understanding, the infrastructure does not support that. So you have people working remotely without access to Wi-Fi, etc. So if you have to do, for example, a national risk assessment or risk assessment, which is something that they have been trying to do for quite a while, how do you get the persons where you need public, private sectors, you need working groups to set up, you need sharing of information to be done when you don't have the infrastructure to do so for the participants? But it is something high on our agenda in terms of Haiti and in terms of always seeking assistance from Haiti, from FATF in terms of French training for them and from our own members and donors.
Okay. So, Dawne, can I have a follow-up with that? And I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'm asking. Haiti is on the ICRG list. You know the impact of economically for countries when they are on the ICRG list. What sort of advocacy can the Secretariat or the CFATF undertake with the FATF to maybe adopt some special measures for Haiti, given its very complex and unique situation? Is there a possibility that Haiti could be taken off the ICRG list, put in a special case? What would you say? Is that a possibility?
I don't know if that's a possibility. What I do know, having worked on the action plan, the CFATF on the action plan for Haiti, is that we did take, at the point in time that that document was developed, the slow momentum within the jurisdiction in terms of developing the action plan. So we have a country in a comparative situation, as an example, may have been given a 1-year time frame to do something. Haiti was given a 3-year time frame to do it, understanding that it would take them longer based on the internal situation. So that compromise and that sort of thinking. So everyone is fully aware. And as things go along, we will see how it pans out. The whole
that's very
processes is to assist the countries. It seems like a penalty, and it is a penalty based on how people respond. But basically, it's to assist the country, and everything is being done to assist Haiti.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear, Dawne. And so I hope that Haiti, some way, would adopt or take advantage of the hiatus, if you will, and do as much as possible to get itself out of that list. So someone says, this is another question. I agree with Dawne that crime is not static. I also think it's important for us to all ask the question as to whether our countries are effective in implementation given our individual risk. I think maybe you addressed that, didn't you, Dawne, that it's a risk-based approach and it's applicable to all the countries in the region.
Yes, very quickly. It's just understanding where your risks are. And I think we don't do that very well. The national risk assessment or sectoral risk assessments, understanding what's your risk, being given an honest evaluation of what is high risk, what is low risk. You talked about earlier on, Shelley answered the question with corruption. Most countries don't want to admit there's a level of corruption, although it's clear in some countries from newspaper articles, from cases. So on a risk-based approach, you have to be honest with yourself, with your strengths, with your weaknesses, and then apply your resources where your risks are high and you have a lot of weaknesses. And if countries understood that and implemented that better, we would certainly get a lot better results in terms of effective implementation.
Okay. This is for everyone. Do you think that perhaps more could be done in terms of messaging the good things that we are doing in the region to the outside world? Because lots of people are making decisions, on the basis of the FATF list, the EU, the US INCSA, possibly, the World Bank, ease of doing business. So do you think there's perhaps more could be done in terms of communicating all the good things that are happening in the region? Because it's important for the success of the CSME and the economic stability for the region. And so, what would you say as to should we be doing more? Any of you?
Well, from my perspective, I think the problem is our dependence on correspondent banking relationships with major financial institutions in the countries that you just listed. I mean, the US, Canada, and the EU. And to that extent, our dependence is often leveraged to ensure compliance in sometimes the most uncompassionate ways. So I, I'm not sure the extent to which messaging can significantly affect the perception of Caribbean countries. We have the vestiges of our blacklisting from the inception of the regime. That has sort of overshadowed our progress to date. And Dawne mentioned it. Financial integrity and transparency standards have been significantly increased. I think they're at the highest level ever in the Caribbean. And we still see the risk in terms of de-risking and being listed. So messaging, I'm sorry to sound pessimistic, but I am not sure if messaging is enough. And I think this is where we need a systemic rethinking of the practices that we've normalized in AML CFT compliance and enforcement.
Okay, thank you, Rohan. Shelley, what do you say?
I agree with Rohan. It is almost like a haunting, if you will, a very live and continuous haunting as far as it relates to the previous backlisting and grey listing and all that has. It is more difficult for a smaller country to absorb those situations when we have a grey listing. Do I believe that we should do messaging? Of course. There's the old adage about not blowing your own trumpet, but then in some cases, if you don't, who will? So it is important that countries can be able to say that they do that. But I think there's also a unspoken fear that when you do that, it almost puts a bullseye on your back, because then person will be forever looking at you. And then once a country does that, that's fine. We must. Being able to maintain that momentum is very, very relevant. So whether in terms of resources, I'm sure Rohan would say, as a colleague would say, Jamaicans say, you're small, but you're talawa. Yes, yes, you're small, but we can certainly, and we always say in Barbados, we punch above our weight. But when we do that, then we must be consistent with our momentum to do that, because the truth of the matter is we're not all regarded as equal. And that's just a reality of the situation. So you can have an FI, and we know them from reading articles on Wells Fargo, HSBC, have major scandals, people commit suicide and what have you. And it's a multi-million-dollar fine and continue to move on. That occurs in Caribbean jurisdiction. That's a serious indictment on us. We would crumble as a jurisdiction if that had happened to any jurisdiction. Okay. So I would say, yes, message, but message with reality, and message with strategy as well.
Okay, thank you. Dawne, I want to ask you the final question, and then we'll do the wrap up. Do you think, right now the FATF is looking at innovative technology to improve the systems, and that's being utilized in CDD and EDD areas, and FinTech and RegTech. But do you think that technology can assist in terms of the actual assessment process as you know it? Is there a possibility for the use of technology in the assessment process, the mutual evaluation process?
Well, the quick and easy answer is yes, simply because we are now doing hybrid assessments, on-site assessments, which requires us to use technology. We have part of our team physically in the country, and we have the other part of the team virtual. In terms of report preparation, there are aspects of it where we use technology in terms of, having all assessors looking at documents. But as a process itself, to do the whole thing virtually, I don't think, because that's what it would mean. The bulk of it is the on-site. That's the virtual part of it, where you sit down and you have the interviews with people, you have the discussions. That is not something that's approved by the FATF at this point in time, and that is something that would take away from the process. There are nuances in terms of a face-to-face dialogue that are sometimes missed in a totally virtual type of setting. And there are things that people can explain and see and walk around and look at. For example, a visitor in FIU that they can't do in the same fashion virtually, or get an understanding or see a pained expression or proud expression on somebody's face. Some of these things are lost. But in terms of AML CFT as a whole, certainly it's going to continue to move in terms of a digital formatting and digital transformation. So that is going to continue to happen. And to me, there needs to be a balance though between that and other types of mechanisms.
Okay, so we have 4 more minutes, and I'd like to get your views and the takeaways that you have with this. So Rohan, you go first. Gentlemen first.
Well, just to say, I think the risk-based approach, to some extent, isn't being applied consistently across the region, but it also doesn't function as effectively as we had hoped in under-resourced developing country context. Effectiveness requires resources, and that's a perennial problem of the Caribbean. Having said that, I think this leveling playing field approach that has underpinned AML CFT regulator governance and compliance has pretty much set up developing countries to fail. I think, especially in the post-pandemic Caribbean, we need to make space for differential treatment. And this can be extended deadlines, compliance deadlines. So we have to be a bit disruptive in our thinking in terms of supporting Caribbean countries' compliance with regimes. We're experiencing the worst financial crisis we've ever had, and recovery is extremely slow. And this goes back to scaling up international cooperation, the international cooperation dimension of AML CFT compliance.
Okay, thank you, Rohan. Shelley, do you think there's need for a Marshall Plan for AML CFT compliance in terms of assisting countries to do the extensive remediation work that's necessary to get their regimes up to par?
If there's a need for extensive,
like a Marshall Plan for, as they did in the World War, after the World War, give countries all the money they need to assist them to get their act together.
Okay, so that's utopia. that's utopia. But certainly there
a little goes a long way though.
Of course. But I will answer it this way. The technical assistance to the private sector, I think, is required more, because there's still, honestly, for fear of not want to admit that there's still a bit of groping in the dark, especially in areas dealing with proliferation financing and those sorts of areas. And FI being comfortable in saying, yes, I know what to look for in terms of my entity being vulnerable for that. I think there's still great level of training and sensitization needs to happen from a private sector point of view. And there we underscore again the private sector, public sector partnerships, but also the technical assistance by the international organizations. Yes, the FI may be able to pay for their own training or what have you, but when it comes from an international organization with a particular standard caliber of individual doing the sensitization, having that also trickle down to the private sector will be really be key. I think we'll see more mileage achieved in that way.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. Dawne, as we come to the end, but I want to ask you, as we look towards the fifth round, do you foresee any significant change to the process, the assessment process? Could the Caribbean lead the way in maybe crafting a new system for the global community?
I think there will be some changes in the process. It will still, however, still be difficult because the focus is going to be more on effective implementation and the level of effectiveness. Because basically it's considered that most of the countries in the global network do have a strong or firm AML CFT framework. There's just about most countries have money laundering, terrorist financing criminalized. Proliferation financing is new, it's difficult, and that's why the recent changes to Recommendation 1 and Recommendation 2 have been kicked down the road to only be assessed during the fifth round. So there's still going to be challenges. It's not going to be a challenge-less process, and that's because effectiveness and how effectively you're implementing is going to remain as the mainstay. It's still going to require a lot of resources, both human and economic resources. So my final words would be increasing an understanding of the risk-based approach, a greater push for public-private sector partnerships, and cooperation and collaboration. We need to do more dialoguing, more talking to each other, more understanding, so that everyone is fully aware of what this process entails and therefore can make a better assessment of what they need to do when the process comes upon them.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much, Dawne, Shelley, Rohan. It's been a pleasure seeing you all again and engaging with you all on this very important topic. We've gone 2 minutes over the time, but I think it was worth it. We haven't had a chance to, respond to all the questions, but I think Toussaint indicated that possibly there may be a conference on AML CFT issues alone, where we'd be able to engage more in a more detailed way about all the issues that need to be covered. So I want to thank you all again. I hope the audience enjoyed our all the thoughts that we provided, and thank you all very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.